why they always leave, and what brings them back. They always leave when things get too close, too intimate, too real. At first, you think it's about you. You replay every word, every glance, every moment they started to shift, pulling away in slow motion, until one day, they're just gone. And yet, somehow, later, they circle back. The message appears. The familiar name lights up your phone. They come back, but never to everyone. So why you? And more importantly, why now? To understand why avoidants return, you first have to understand why they run. Dismissive avoidants aren't wired to chase closeness. They're wired to survive it. Because closeness, to them, feels like danger. Not because you did anything wrong, but because intimacy brushes up against every buried part of themselves they've worked hard to suppress. Their inner child was trained not to need, not to trust, not to expect connection to last. So when someone gets too close, especially someone stable, warm, and emotionally open, it awakens a panic they don't fully recognize. They confuse love with loss, connection with control, vulnerability with threat, and so they disappear. But here's the paradox. Avoidants aren't emotionless. They're overwhelmed by emotion. They don't fear intimacy because they don't want it. They fear it because it matters too much. So when they pull away, they're not trying to punish you. They're trying to regulate their fear. And the only way they know how is distance. But then time passes. The tension softens. The storm quiets. And what once felt like suffocation now feels like silence. That's when the memory of you begins to shift. Not as the danger, but as the calm. Not as the pressure, but as the peace. And now, they want back in. But they don't come back to just anyone. Avoidants don't return to the person who chased them. They don't come back to chaos, to conflict, to emotional reactivity. They come back to what they ran from, but secretly longed for. Security, not just in you, but in how you responded to the distance, to the silence, to the disappearance. Because when you didn't beg, when you didn't collapse, when you didn't try to fix them, you told a story their nervous system didn't expect. I won't abandon myself to keep you. And that is magnetic to the avoidant mind. They come back to people who held their boundaries, without turning cold, who stayed soft, without staying stuck. They come back to the person who didn't need to be chosen to know their worth. Because that's what an avoidant can't forget. You didn't fight for a connection they weren't ready for. You gave them space, not as punishment, but as proof that love doesn't have to mean pressure. You walked away with peace, and that stillness haunts them more than any outburst ever could. The response they don't expect, but can't let go of. When an avoidant pulls away, they expect one of two things: explosion or pursuit. They've learned that love often turns into pressure, that people will chase them when they retreat, or punish them for withdrawing. And when you don't do either, when you respond with quiet clarity instead of chaos, it breaks their pattern. Suddenly, they're not in control of the emotional narrative anymore. You are. And yet, you didn't punish. You didn't provoke. You didn't wait by the door with desperate hope. You just stopped proving, stopped convincing, stopped shrinking yourself for someone who wasn't ready. And that calm response, that's what sticks in their psyche. Avoidants aren't used to emotional maturity. They're used to entanglement, to emotional flooding that confirms their worst fear. If I get close, I'll lose myself. But when you chose self-respect over reactivity, you showed them something new. You can step back, and I still won't abandon who I am. You became emotionally regulated in the face of their chaos. And now, that memory lives inside them. A blueprint they didn't know they were missing. Avoidants are haunted not by words, but by what wasn't said. They expect drama, but you gave them peace. They expected you to fight to stay, but you chose to honor your own worth instead. And long after you've gone quiet, they're still reliving your reaction, not because it hurt them, but because it disarmed them. You were different. Here's what they can't shake. You didn't stay to earn love. You left to protect it. And not everyone does that. That choice, it shifts something in them. Not right away, not always consciously, but somewhere deep inside. They start to associate you with something they couldn't define at the time. Safety. Not the safety of someone who clings harder when they disappear, but the kind of safety that doesn't turn love into a performance. Here's the truth. Avoidants are attracted to chaos until they experience peace. And once they've had a taste of it, real emotional stability, they remember, not in the middle of the noise, but in the silence that follows it, in the emptiness of their next connection, in the hollowness of being with someone who doesn't see them, or who sees too much and demands more than they can give. It's in that space that your presence begins to echo. And it's not what you said, it's how you stayed composed. It's how you walked away from the emotional tug of war. They didn't even know they were playing. The avoidant mind fixates on what feels safe but rare. They don't come back to people who lost themselves trying to keep them. They come back to people who stayed grounded in their own identity, because that's what creates a new internal narrative for them. That's what makes them rethink everything they've believed about connection. They didn't lose someone who abandoned them. They lost someone who chose peace over drama, truth over tension, and self-worth over chasing. And that, quietly, begins to unravel their avoidant armor. You're not the person they expected to forget. You're the one they return to in their mind, when everything else feels loud, fake, and temporary. You're the contrast. You didn't just say you were secure. You showed it in the moment it mattered most. And now, they're wondering if maybe, just maybe, they got it wrong. What they secretly needed, and why you were the first to give it. Avoidants have needs, deep ones, but they've spent years pretending they don't. They'll tell you they're fine alone, that they don't need anything serious, that they're not built for emotional intimacy. But that's not the truth. The truth is, their entire nervous system is built on one early message. Needing people isn't safe. So they shut the door on their own vulnerability. They become independent, not because it makes them happy, but because it makes them feel in control. But when they meet someone who doesn't try to pry that door open, someone who simply exists in their own wholeness, they start to feel something they haven't felt in a long time. Permission. Permission to be. Permission to need. Permission to come closer, without fear of being consumed. And that permission isn't something you said. It's something they felt in your presence. You were consistent, but not overbearing. Open, but not invasive. Kind, but not self-sacrificing. And that combination, that's what made you unforgettable. Avoidants don't trust emotions, especially their own. But when you stayed emotionally grounded, you became something they never had growing up. A mirror that didn't distort them. A presence that didn't demand they perform. A connection that felt calm, not chaotic. And even if they pushed it away, even if they ghosted or disappeared, they noticed. Because for the first time, they weren't punished for being distant. They weren't shamed for not being ready. They weren't met with fear, rage, or desperation. They were met with space. Space that didn't feel like abandonment, but like self-respect. This is the healing they didn't know they needed. You gave them a relationship blueprint that wasn't built on urgency. One that didn't chase or collapse. One that could love without losing itself. And for someone used to emotional enmeshment or neglect, that was revolutionary. It wasn't what they said they wanted, but it was what they never received. And now, without realizing it, they're comparing every new interaction to yours. Not because you made them feel intensely, but because you made them feel safe. And safety lasts longer than chemistry ever could. When the avoidant disappears, they don't expect you to stay calm. They expect a storm. They expect the same emotional pattern they've seen before. Anxious pursuit, guilt, resentment. But you didn't do that. You let go without shutting down. You chose dignity over drama. And in doing so, you became a reference point for a new kind of connection. One that doesn't beg, one that doesn't break, and most importantly, one that doesn't betray itself in the name of love. That's why they come back. Not because you begged, not because you waited, but because you didn't. You gave them what no one else had. The experience of being with someone who loved them deeply, without needing them to change. And ironically, that's what changes them. Not right away, not in a dramatic, movie scene kind of way, but slowly, quietly, in the moments they least expect it. When they feel a sudden ache, a sense of calm they can't recreate, a memory that doesn't burn, but lingers. That's when they realize it wasn't your words they miss. It was your presence and the way you made them feel. Free, but still held. What makes you the exception and why they'll never forget it. Most people don't realize this, but avoidants remember everything. Not in the way anxious types do, with overt longing and replayed conversations, but in silence, in stillness, in the quiet comparisons they make when no one's watching. And you became the exception, not because you were the loudest, not because you demanded their love, but because you didn't. You let them go, with peace in your hands and dignity in your step. And that response, it branded something deep into their nervous system, because no one had ever loved them like that before. With strength, with softness, with sovereignty. Avoidants push people away because they fear losing themselves. But you didn't try to own them. You didn't try to convince them. You weren't fighting for closeness. You were embodying it. You were calm when they were unsure. You were secure in what you felt, even if they weren't ready to meet you there. And instead of chasing, you chose yourself. That's what made you different. That's what made them look back. Because in the moment you stopped trying to change their mind, they started questioning their own. And not just about you, but about every pattern they've ever run on. They started to realize, not everyone wants to consume me. Not everyone will abandon me. Not everyone will betray me when I finally let my guard down. They started seeing that maybe, just maybe, the fear they've lived in wasn't about others. It was about them, their walls, their stories, their unresolved grief. But you didn't try to fix it. You just showed them, by example, what it looks like to be whole. You didn't collapse to be chosen. You didn't self-abandon for closeness. You didn't chase someone who wasn't emotionally available. You let go with love. And that kind of letting go doesn't disappear. It echoes. It shows up in their next relationship, in the disconnect they feel with someone who doesn't challenge them to grow, in the restlessness they can't explain when no one's pressing them to be present, in the hollowness of a connection that lacks depth, because they tasted what depth could feel like with you. And now, surface level won't satisfy them. You weren't perfect, but you were aware. You weren't waiting to be picked. You were offering connection from a place of self-knowledge. You weren't performing to be loved. You were loving from a place that didn't demand control. And that's what avoidants remember. They don't come back to people who tried to prove they were the one. They come back to people who already knew they were. Because you were the one person who didn't try to earn love. You embodied it. You stood in it. And when it wasn't reciprocated, you walked away, not to punish them, but to preserve yourself. And nothing shakes an avoidant more than losing someone who wasn't afraid to lose them first. That's what they carry. Not guilt, not regret, but a deep, internal question they can't answer. Why does their presence still feel safer than anyone else's? And that question? It's what makes them come back. Not always with words. Sometimes with silence, checking your stories. Sometimes with delayed messages. Or just wondering how your texts. Sometimes with nothing but energy. The weight of your absence pressed against their chest, when no one else can reach them. But even in that silence, you're the one they remember. What happens when you don't chase, but they still find their way back? Something strange happens when you stop chasing people who pull away. You begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that used to disappear in pursuit. You no longer ask, how do I get them to come back? You ask, what part of me thought I had to follow them in the first place? And in that shift, in that quiet, internal pivot, you become magnetic in a way that's impossible to fake. Because you're no longer attached to whether they choose you. You're attached to whether you choose peace. And when that becomes your baseline, the dynamic changes completely. Avoidants are used to being pursued. They're used to disappearing and returning. To find the same door open, the same heart waiting, the same person still hoping they'll finally stay. But this time, it's different. You didn't just walk away. You transformed. You didn't wait by the door. You rebuilt the house. You stopped orbiting around someone else's emotional capacity. And instead, you came home to your own. That's the moment they feel it. The moment the pull reverses. The person who was once running from connection now starts wondering if they're the one who's been left behind. And maybe they reach out. Maybe they don't. But whether they do or not no longer defines your value. Because now you understand. Their return was never the victory. Your return to yourself was. You stopped being the person who proves your worth through patience. You stopped waiting to be chosen. You chose yourself. And paradoxically, that's what creates the very thing they once ran from. Attraction rooted in respect, not rescue. Desire rooted in sovereignty, not sacrifice. Love that's offered, but not chased. When avoidants do come back, and many do, they often expect to find the old dynamic waiting. They expect you to still be emotionally available, still hoping, still longing, still ready. But instead, they find something else. A calm they don't recognize. A boundary they didn't expect. A version of you that doesn't shrink just to keep the peace. And that version of you, that's the one they can't forget. Because it's the first time they've ever felt love. That doesn't plead, but stands still. Love that says, you're free to choose me, but I won't abandon myself to keep you here. And if they're ready, if their growth has caught up to their heart, they'll stay. Not because they're afraid of losing you, but because they finally realize what being loved by you actually meant. Because when you loved them, you didn't just offer attention. You offered clarity. You didn't just provide comfort. You showed them a mirror. And that mirror didn't beg them to stay. It simply revealed who they could be. If they were brave enough to come closer. And if they're not ready, if they never reach back out, if they never return, then you still win. Because you didn't lose anything. You healed something. You finally stepped off the roller coaster. You stopped trying to decode silence. You broke the cycle, not just with them, but within yourself. You became someone who no longer makes people your home, because you found it inside you. And once that happens, you don't just attract people, you attract truth. So if you're wondering why the avoidant comes back, know this. It was never about proving your worth. It was about reclaiming it. And the moment you stopped chasing their love, they felt what true love actually looks like. Not a performance, not a sacrifice, but a presence so full. It doesn't need to beg, just be. And That's unforgettable.